Hello everybody and welcome back to a new video. My name is Sarah and today I'm going to go through my September wrap-up. So in the month of September I read 6 books. If you watched my September TBR video, you'll know that I was hoping to make a dent in my book of the month backlog that I have. I did, kind of accomplish that a little bit. However, there were 2 highly anticipated releases that did come out this month that I couldn't hold off on. I just had to read them. So I ended up reading 4 of my book of the month books, and then the other 2 were the 2 anticipated releases. So we are just gonna hop right into it. The first book that I read in September was Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin. Now this is kind of a rare book because I actually did tab it. I normally never tab books when I read them, but I did tab this one. Just as a side note, the color tabs don't coordinate to anything. I do know a lot of people when they tab, they have things like color coded, like sad things are blue and like certain quotes are like green or whatever. I didn't do that. I mostly just tabbed things that kind of like resonated with me somehow, or maybe they just were beautiful quotes, or just something that really made me think while reading this story. But I had realized very early on while reading this that there was going to be a lot of beautiful lines, and I just felt the urge to tab it, and I actually had a lot of fun with it. So this is kind of I guess you could call it historical fiction, but it's in the 80s. It starts in the 80s and we move up through early 2000s. So it feels weird to me to call it historical, but I guess you could call it either contemporary or historical. We are following our 2 main characters, Sadie and Sam, as they meet when they're children, and then over the course of roughly 30 years grow together as best friends and creative equals and creative partners, and they end up developing this video game, which then turns into a video game company where they work together as creative partners to develop games. And this book, it says right in the inside jacket, it says 2 friends often in love but never lovers, and then it says at the very bottom, yes, it is a love story, but it is not one you have read before. Basically, we're following these characters in their kind of really unique, complicated relationship as creative partners that have a very wild myriad of emotions and feelings towards each other that never really get resolved, I guess. But it's just a really beautifully kind of melancholy feeling book. When I was reading this, it really felt like a more melancholic version of a Wes Anderson film. Just with how the tone and kind of how the characters were written, there's kind of this weird dry quirkiness to some of the characters, but with a very melancholic side to it. There's also several really devastating events that occurred during this book, and so we're following the characters as they deal with those events and kind of how they pick each other up or pull each other through or push each other away. We're also kind of just following the characters as they deal with their complicated relationship, and then how they deal with the other characters' relationships with other people and how that affects them. And it's just very interesting, but I think kind of one of the best ways to describe it is like a melancholic Wes Anderson film. But overall, I feel like this is a book that I really haven't read many similar books to. It's got just a very unique vibe to it, but overall I did end up giving it 4.5 stars. So the next I read The Maid by Nita Prose. This is a quite short murder mystery novel, but I would honestly consider this more of a cozy murder mystery. So we're following our main character, Molly Gray. So she is a maid at this very high-end 5-star hotel. She's neurodivergent and has a hard time distinguishing people's facial expressions and kind of the emotions and reading conversation emotions. She really struggles to do that and read people and understand kind of the nuances of what people are saying versus what they actually mean. She also takes things very, very literally, and she is very keen on proper manners and cleanliness, and she truly adores her job as a maid. And one day she's cleaning out a super rich dude's hotel suite and ends up finding him dead in his bed. And because of her very peculiar reactions to things and her misunderstanding cues and kind of what people are asking her, and she answers in a certain way, she is then deemed the prime murder suspect, and so then she and her friends have to end up uncovering who actually murdered this man in order to clear her name. Now, I enjoyed this, but I enjoyed it for different reasons than what I would normally enjoy a murder mystery for. In this book, honestly, you as the reader figure out most of what's going on pretty early on in this book. You're able to piece together and figure it out or get a general gist of it pretty quickly. There is, I will say, one twist at the end that you don't see coming, or at least that I didn't see coming, and that isn't kind of very obvious to you as the reader. What this book really entails is that you as the reader know what's going on, but you're following Molly as she is struggling to interpret what's really going on in the world around her, and then she has to end up figuring out who is actually helping her and has her best intentions in mind, and who is using her lack of, I guess, understanding of people's motives and kind of the world around her, and using that to their own advantage. The murder mystery is obviously a big part of the book, but this is really about Molly as she figures out kind of her place in the world and who truly cares about her and who is truly a friend of her. Molly has a very unique voice. She's very interesting to read from. She's a very lovable character. Like, you can't help just rooting for her and getting so angry over how she was treated by certain people. And I was like fuming at certain points. And of course there are other characters that you know have her best intentions in mind, so you're just like, Molly, stick with them. Like, they'll help you out. So yeah, I think I honestly would consider this like a cozy murder mystery because of some of those elements. I don't think it's really a book that's going to stick with me for a long time, but it was a very enjoyable book while I was reading it. I did kind of wish that the murder mystery was more of a mystery element for the reader, but I understand what the author was trying to do here, and I do think that it was executed well. But overall, I did end up giving this 3 stars. And then after that, I read, along with half of booktube, Babel by R.F. Kuang. This is R.F. Kuang's latest release. It did come out this month. This is the Fairy Loot edition. Look at these edges. Oh, they're so gorgeous. So in this book, we're following Robin, and he's originally from Canton, China, but he was orphaned there and then picked up by a mysterious guardian and brought to England in order to kind of be raised up and taught this really rigorous course load of furthering his understanding of Mandarin as well as English and then Latin and Greek in order to be enrolled in Oxford's Translation Institute, Babel. And so we're following Robin from when he was very young as he grows up, and then as he gets enrolled at Oxford in this Translation Institute. Very quickly, kind of a underground organization ends up making contact with Robin, and he ends up having to deal with the confusion of loving Oxford and what he has, but realizing that Babel and Oxford are really fueling the expansion of the British Empire and colonialism. And this book does have a magical element to it where there are these like silver bars, and you put like a word and then its translation in a different language, and then kind of the gap in translation or what's lost in the translation is then manifested through this silver bar. And so there is this, that is like a magical element. It does play an important part in this book, but it's not a super big fantastical element, if that makes sense. What we're really following is Robin as he has to address kind of his role in colonialism as kind of a enabler, but also as a person of color, and it's very, very interesting. Arc 1 pulls no punches, just like in the Poppy War, when exploring these very multi-layered ideas. It's just she just does a phenomenal job, and I do want to make a couple of points. This book starts out really slow for me. I know a lot of people said that they thought that the pacing was great and they were hooked right from the start. For me, I actually was kind of worried in the beginning. I wasn't sure how I was gonna end up liking this. Like, I was enjoying it, but it didn't grip me nearly as much as the Poppy War did right from the get-go. However, I think that kind of like slowness in the beginning, or that vibe that I was having a hard time kind of getting into, does play a part in kind of what the story is trying to do. And so I will say, if you feel the same way, I think just keep with it, because there comes a point in the book where Robin himself has a kind of turning point in his interpretation of the world, and then the story has a turning point in kind of the vibe of the story, and I think they parallel each other very well and work together. I do also want to say, some people have complained that the villains in this book are super obvious, and I think that's the whole point. I think you as the reader are supposed to be able to see who's going to end up opposing Robin, or kind of you know, working against him. But Robin is kind of blinded to all of that, just like he's blinded to kind of like his role in enabling the British Empire. And so his blindness makes him not able to see who, you know, is going to actually have his best interests in mind. It all goes hand in hand, and I'm trying not to spoil a whole lot, but I do think that those are important things that I did want to mention. But I think this is just a book you just need to read it. And Arv Kwan, she's such a strong writer. Her ability to just dissect these societal issues and how they affect various people is just so fascinating and so well done. I honestly think that she is a literary genius, and then the way that this book ended, it hurt so bad, but there was no other possible way for her to end it with how everything was going, and it fits so well, but it really hurts. And I think it's needless to say that I did give this 5 stars. So then next I read my other very highly anticipated release from the month of September, and I think it just goes without saying right away that I gave it 5 stars, back-to-back 5 stars, and that is Nona the Ninth. This is the 3rd book in the Locked Tomb series, the first book in the series being Gideon the Ninth. And what's really interesting is that, yes, all 3 of these books that are out so far are in the same series, but they all have such a very distinct storyline and like kind of theme and voice and tone to them that they are all linked, and you need to read them all together, but they feel very different from each other. And obviously I can't talk too much about what this book really entails because it is the 3rd one, but in order to give you kind of an idea of like the vibe of this series and this fantasy sci-fi world, I will explain what Gideon the Ninth is about. So in that book we're following Gideon, who is an indentured swordswoman to the 9th house of this giant galactic empire, and one day she ends up being coerced into being the right-hand swordswoman, or the cavalier, to Harrow the Ninth, who is the heir to the 9th house. So the 2 of them absolutely hate each other, but they're forced to work together in order for Harrow to compete to kind of ascend to this top-tier necromancer and be the emperor's, one of the emperor's closest confidants, and kind of like his court, I guess. And so the 2 of them, along with various other heirs and cavaliers from the 9 houses of the empire, are kind of exploring this like decrepit mansion and solving necromantic puzzles, and it's very fun. This whole series has lots of gore and like visceral magic. This is a very, very bone and blood and guts filled magic system. This is also a series where Tamsin Muir expects a lot out of her readers, where she just drops the reader in the middle of this world and is told to keep up and figure it out because we're moving on. This book is kind of similar to Harrow, where you're even more confused about what's going on because you're not quite sure the character's mindset, and like we're in a completely different setting. The character themselves doesn't know what's going on around them to an extent that you would want to know, I guess. So because the character doesn't know, you as the reader don't know. This one is a bit easier to follow than Harrow the Ninth for the most part. There are some things that I still really struggled with putting together and following, but once you are able to put those pieces together, it is so worth it. In this book we also get a much more of a background of like how this whole universe has come to be the way that it is, which was super interesting. And then Nona herself as a character is just so fun. This little tagline here says, "You will love Nona and Nona loves you," is just a very apt description of how Nona views the world and how she just worms her way into other characters and you as the reader's hearts. Yeah, she's just so fun, and I cannot wait for Electa the Ninth, which will be the fourth and final book in this series. No idea when it's coming out. Obviously this one just came out, but I need some final answers for this series. So then the fifth book that I read during the month of September was A History of Wild Places by Shea Ernshaw. So this is kind of a magical realism thriller. And I honestly am going to read you the inside cover because I think that it gives you the best description without me accidentally spoiling things. So it says, Travis Wren has an unusual talent for locating missing people. Hired by families as a last resort, he requires only a single object to find the person who has vanished. When he takes on the case of Maggie St. James, a well-known author of dark, macabre children's books, he's led to a place many believe to be only a legend. Known as Pastoral, this reclusive community was founded by like-minded people searching for a simpler way of life. But soon after Travis stumbles upon it, he disappears, just like Maggie St. James. Years later, Theo, a lifelong member of Pastoral, discovers Travis's abandoned truck beyond the border of the community. No one is allowed in or out, not without the risk of bringing a disease, the rot, into Pastoral. Unraveling the mystery of what happened reveals secrets that Theo, his wife Calla, and her sister Bee keep from one another. Secrets that prove that their perfect, isolated world isn't as safe as they believed, and that darkness takes many forms. Hauntingly beautiful, hypnotic, and bewitching, A History of Wild Places is a story about fairy tales, our fear of the dark, and losing yourself within the wilderness of your mind. And this was like a pretty anticipated read of mine when it arrived in the Book of the Month box last December, and I just have never gotten around to it. And while I did enjoy reading this book and I had a really good time with it, I was ultimately disappointed in it. I think that it's a good book, and I think it's a good book if you aren't very well versed in psychological thrillers. And I guess I'm not saying I am like super familiar with like tons of psychological thrillers, but psychological thrillers and psychological horror are kind of my favorite subgenres of thriller and horror, the thriller and horror genres. And this I think is good if you are very, like, if it's your first time like dipping your toe into these subgenres. I think Shea Ernshaw's writing is beautiful. I think it's got this like very hypnotic feel to it, very full of like sensory details, and I did absolutely love that. So I do definitely want to look up more of Shea Ernshaw's works. But this, it was clever but too heavy-handed in the like what is actually going on in this story, because I caught on to it a bit earlier than I think I should have, and because of that, when it was finally revealed what was going on, it wasn't as satisfying as like it normally would be, considering how clever it is. I also just got really mad at one character who like, these characters are not dumb. They're smart, they're clever, and they, you know, and it's just one character made a decision at like this really intense moment, like everything's coming to a head, and she made this really stupid decision that I'm like, why would you make that? You've never made a stupid decision leading up to this. Like, why would you decide to do that when you know what's gonna happen? And it's like, I get then the consequence of that then led to more tension further down and everything like that, and it was just tension builder, but it just didn't make sense to have the character make that decision, and I was really frustrated with it. That's the one like biggest critique of this book. The rest of it is just like, I wish it wasn't like what's actually happening wasn't quite as heavy-handed as it was. And because of that, I did end up giving this 3 stars, but like I said, I do think that this would be a really good entry-level book for somebody trying to get into kind of a more psychological thriller book. And then lastly, I picked up my nonfiction read for this month. Now, I was kind of reading this while I was reading some of these other books, but it was finished last, so that's why I'm saying it was the last book I read. And that is The Devil in the White City by Erik Larson. So the full title is The Devil in the White City: Murder, Magic, and Madness at the Fair That Changed America. So in this book, we're alternating chapters from kind of like who we're following, because we are following Daniel Burnham as he leads the construction of the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, and then we're also following H.H. Holmes as he becomes more and more murderous and leads up to the building of his kind of infamous murder hotel that was located right, you know, a few blocks away from the World's Fair that he then used to lure people to stay at his hotel. So this was super interesting. However, I was a little disappointed with how the split ended up being between like the discussion of Burnham and the World's Fair, and then Holmes and his murderous tendencies in his hotel. You know, it felt like it should have been a 50-50 split, but it ended up being more like a 60-40, almost 65-35 split, where it felt like we spent much more of our time discussing the architecture behind the fair. And while that was super interesting, I did want, you know, a more even distribution of time spent between the fair and H.H. Holmes. This also did get quite dry in some areas. We spend a lot of time going over a lot of the details of the architecture and the construction of the fair, which was very interesting, but like I said, dry. I did find it really fun to kind of learn about a lot of Chicago during this very tumultuous time. There was a lot of change underway. It was interesting to learn about kind of some of the other buildings that are now still standing in Chicago, and kind of how they came about and what they're used for now and what they were originally intended for. And not to mention some of the very prolific names that ended up somehow being tied into the fair, whether or not they had a hand in creating the fair, or whether they just went and enjoyed the fair for its entertainment. That was super interesting. I think if you're looking for just kind of a random history book to pick up, or if you're really interested in kind of this turn of the century time period, or the fair, or H.H. Holmes, I do think it is a good book to read. I just I wish we kind of delved into some more things with it, but overall I did find it very fascinating to read. I did end up giving it 3 stars. So these are the 6 books that I read during the month of September. If you've read any of these, or if you're curious to read any of them, let me know down in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. But of course, I really appreciate you guys watching this video. If you made it to the end, thank you so much for sticking around with me. I hope you consider sticking around even longer and subscribing if you haven't already. But as always, I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!